Hello, this is Patrick Ash, author, musician, elder millennial with the angst to go with it. And I wanted to talk today about movies. I haven't really talked about this on my channel yet, so I wanted to do a video blog on particularly my 3 favorite movies of all time. And it's a little bit, not so much unpopular, but rather these picks are not super well known. I'll probably put them in the title, so you probably know what they are already. But they are ones that I think had somewhat either mixed reviews or obscure in their genre or for their director. It does. I think the interest for me is because these are my top 3, whereas other movies like in my top 10, I've got Star Wars and Matrix and like Tarantino movies, 2001. So those are, of course, very well known. You can talk about those ad nauseum, but I want to talk about my top 3 because they're important to me, and I feel like more people should know about them, or at least why they're important to me. So let me start with number 3. I'll work my way up, and at number 3 is Ikiru, which I believe is a pronunciation. Hope it is, by Kurosawa. Kurosawa, of course, known for Seven Samurai and, Rashomon and a lot of films that inspired, like the spaghetti westerns, like Good, Bad, and the Ugly and stuff like that. But all this stuff is really good. I really enjoy all of Kurosawa's movies. But Ikiru is one that like when I first saw it, it's crazy to me because if you've read my novel, Upon This Pale Hill, the themes between the two of them are actually quite similar. And in fact, I was halfway or most of the way through writing the first draft of my novel when it was like recommended to me by a friend. And when I saw it, it was like immediate. I was like, this is speaks straight to my heart. And if you've seen it, I mean, I don't know how spoiler I'll be with this, but it's basically about Japanese bureaucrat who finds out he has, a terminal disease and he doesn't have long to live. And he goes from living a life where he's just going through the motions and kind of on autopilot, you might say, to thinking, if I'm going to die soon, how am I going to make the most of my remaining time? And so he seeks to understand what it means, and the meaning of the title is to live, is what Ikiru means. So he wants to know, what does it mean to live? And he kind of meets different characters this is very much like my novel. So it's unintentional, again. I was most of the way through my first draft when and the rest of it had been planned when I heard about this movie. And I was getting into Kurosawa at the time, so, but yeah, like the idea of like trying to find out what it means to have a meaningful life, to have one that you feel like you've made the most out of or done what you wanted to do. And so he meets different people that kind of like introduce him to other kind of ways of living. And it's not that there's a definite right or wrong answer, but there is kind of like a clear, for his role, for where, he was in society, he finds that's something I can do. Again, I don't want to spoil it because it's profound. I just absolutely love it. I think it was loosely based off of Tolstoy novel, I want to say. I know Kurosawa also liked Dostoevsky. I love Dostoevsky, especially Notes from Underground, which also I had read Notes from Underground when I wrote my book, and there's a lot of similar themes there as well. But the idea of the protagonist trying to find what their role is in society. I'll say in my book, it's not that he has a terminal illness; it's coming of age. He's graduating college, and he's just not sure what he wants to do. And but they're both kind of like facing that question of what do I want to do with my life, and they come to somewhat similar conclusions, even down to like the field they work in, which incidentally happens to be a similar field to where, I work in public service. So I think both my book and the movie kind of try to make it clear that it's not that you have to do exactly what that character does, but rather based on where they are in the world, they find their way, the best way they can contribute. And I make this point in my book where with some of the other characters and how they turn out, of that they have different fields, but that they also kind of do commendable things, just in different fields. So yeah. So you can obviously see that both this movie and my book, there's just a lot of similar themes. It speaks to my heart. And I also think just the way it was filmed, the shots. I say this, and I didn't mean this. I honestly did not mean this to happen. But if you look at the cover of Ikiru, the famous shot with him sitting on the swing, and the cover of my novel, Upon This Pale Hill, I didn't realize this until recently. I released a book last April, but my graphic designer and I kind of collaborated about ideas of how to do the cover, and I like this one picture of me where I was like standing on train tracks in the snow, and he kind of like worked his graphic design magic on it. They're actually somewhat similar images. A single figure in the snow, with a kind of a dark background. So that was not intentional, believe it or not. But yeah, love that film. It really is quite touching. It's a Japanese film. I think it came out in the mid-50s, I want to say. And so I want to say like 56. But yeah, so definite. That's my number 3 all time. So let's. How much water here do I? Let me. Coincidentally, I've got the soundtrack right here. Go up to my second pick, my number 2 film of all time, Darren Aronofsky's The Fountain. I absolutely love this film. I think it has a little bit of its overall reviews, like this in my top pick, were mixed, and still, I think to this day, a lot of people will be like, "Oh, that's my least favorite Aronofsky movie." I love all of his movies, honestly, just to different degrees. But a lot of people say like Requiem for a Dream, and well, that would be my number 2. Or they like Black Swan or the Wrestler. Wrestler's good. I think it's a little overrated. But people usually consider the Fountain, overblown or too emotional, I don't know. There's lots of critiques. And I will say that some of the flaws I think are quite obvious. Like I think the color representations of between the white and the gold, I think he does a little bit too much of. I actually think of so many movies, like tons of movies, of course, could be shorter. Your 2.5, 3 hour long movies. This movie is right at an hour and a half. I actually think it could be a little bit longer. I actually think filling in a little bit more about their lives, and in fact, the graphic novel, the Fountain graphic novel, I think has more detail, and I think just a little bit more might help kind of bring out the characters and the 3 different time periods. I didn't talk about the premise, but for those who do not know, it's a story that's basically told in 3 different time periods between 2 characters, male and female lead, and it's essentially kind of about the quest for immortality, and it's to live an Ikiru, or immortality, to live forever in the fountain. And so it's it's Spain in let's say about 1500s, and then modern day, and then the future 2500. So they're like 500 years apart each. And the events of each time period kind of relate to each other, and then it kind of brings up questions like what's in the story, what is fictional or what is real. and they're kind of interacting with each other to some degree. And I think it's part of why I love it so much is that it's meant for interpretation, of kind of make it your own of what the story really means. And so there's just so much I love about it. The sound, as I was just holding up here, the soundtrack from Clint Mansell is one of the best soundtracks of all time. It's absolutely fantastic. I start to hear some of these tracks, and it's just immediately striking, and it fits perfectly with the movie. And so it's hard to really describe what, one of those things, like it's hard to really describe why you love it. It's like, yeah, it has good performances, like, Hugh Jackman and Rachel Weisz, and the visuals are excellent. It uses kind of like that micro photography, I think it is, to illustrate the future being like a dying star that will be used to kind of anyway, it's kind of mystical, kind of spiritual, but it's just I don't know, the themes are, I feel like, universal themes of, ultimately, I think what it's really about, even though like the quest for immortality is kind of how it's pitched, like I think the tagline was like, what if you could live forever, or something like that. It's ultimately, for me, my interpretation, it's about dealing with grief. It's about how do you process knowing someone you love is going to die. And I think to a lesser degree, it's about one's own mortality, that one day that's going to happen. One day we'll be, gone. And so the film really explores those, and it sits. And the thing that I like is it sits with it, and not in like a. I'm sure a critic could say like it's artsy or pretentious or whatever, but to me it's quite heartfelt. I think both in Darren Aronofsky's writing, as well as kind of like how the actors treat the material, it's meant to kind of be, in my understanding, as kind of a way to process thoughts and emotions around death and loss and grief. And so I think there's even more to it than that. Honestly, I love the interplay between the different time periods, and some of it's sweet. It's about relationships, and just the mere act of like, there's something to be said for in a way, it's almost a counterpoint to Ikiru, where Ikiru is about what do you do with your life, like what actions do you take so that your life has meaning and you're not just kind of going through the motions. Whereas the fountain is, in a way, is sort of like, yeah, that's important, but also like appreciation, like stop and smell the roses. It's not just about the things you do, but who you are. So, there really is, yeah, kind of like between the two movies, kind of two sides to the same coin. In fact, there's a shot that Darren Aronofsky uses in The Fountain that is very much inspired. I say inspired by, like it's almost the exact same shot. Sorry, my cat's come to visit. She's doing this a lot lately. But it's almost the exact same shot between the two films, where the character is walking down the street in silence. And they're obviously like totally in their minds. And then suddenly the traffic like alerts them to their, brings them back to reality. So anyway, love The Fountain. My second all-time favorite movie. It is my favorite, obviously it's my favorite Aronofsky movie, even though a lot of people don't put it that high. And some people just are very dismissive and say, oh, it's just schmaltzy, feel good, blah, blah, blah. Like, rarely do films, I think, go that, just try to process those universal feelings, where it's like, let's just go straight for it in this medium. And I get different things out of it every time I watch it. It means different things to me when I rewatch it, over the years. So anyway, that's The Fountain. So my number one film of all time, if I had to pick one, it's one of those like I don't love to. I could talk about some of the other ones, some of the more popular ones. Superman's one of my all-time favorite films. Wizard of Oz, ones that are more kind of typical, well-known. But my favorite all-time film is Immortal, Beloved. Gary Oldman as Ludwig von Beethoven. And it came out in the mid-90s. Bernard Rose was the director. I'll just say the thing that I love most about this is that it transcends its medium. This is it's essentially a biopic about Beethoven, and kind of like The Fountain, it's kind of pitched as one way, but I feel like it's more so something else. It's pitched as being what is the identity of the immortal beloved? If you don't know, it's a letter that Beethoven, real life Beethoven had written. That's kind of left as a mystery of who, since he died unmarried, who was the love of his life, even though he had written many romantic letters. So the film kind of is supposed to be about answering that question and kind of going through different candidates. But that's just the setup. That's kind of like just the pitch or whatever. It really, much more than that, it really is about who Beethoven was and what his music meant and what it accomplished ultimately. If you don't know much about Beethoven, not only was he a fantastic composer, you would recognize many of his pieces, even if you didn't know that's who he was. But for much of his life, he was deaf. He went deaf, and yet he was still composing, including some of his best music. In fact, the Ninth Symphony, which, if I was pushed to pick a favorite composition of all time, it would be the Ninth Symphony, fourth movement. I don't even like hearing it kind of like out of context. It's one of those like I want to hear it in its entirety, because it's just talk about something I get something different out of every time I experience it. It's just very, very just the pinnacle of classical music, and it kind of defies words. And yet, in Immortal Beloved, there is a scene toward the end of the movie that I feel like if there was a visual representation of what that composition means, I feel like Bernard Rose and filmmakers somehow miraculously managed to capture that. Beethoven means a lot to me personally. I can go through. I've got. In fact, I think you might be able to see some of the books back there on my bookshelf are actually Beethoven biopics over there. Not biopics, but biographies. The Solomon and the Jen Swafford and some of the other ones. But there's so many ways in which I've kind of related to Beethoven's personality, like in the Enneagram system, and as well as just artistically, he was at that kind of turning point between classical music and romantic music. And I could talk at long length just about Beethoven himself and what his music meant. Now, I will say about Immortal Beloved, it's not meant to be, dead on historically accurate. There are for sure there's liberties taken to kind of tell a better story. He messes with the timeline a bit, and I think ultimately his candidate for the Immortal, like who the argument the writer-director makes is one of those like arguable, unlikely kind of things. I won't spoil it. But, it's possible. And again, I don't think that's ultimately the real point. And I think even the person who asserts to be the immortal beloved, the rationale that's like within the movie, the rationale she uses is related to who Beethoven was at his core. As the eulogy they repeat at the beginning of the movie and is from the real life one, although they had a different character deliver it rather than I always forget that guy's name who delivered his eulogy. But he was an artist, Beethoven that is. He was an artist, and who will stand beside him? That kind of sums it up. So I think the film really succeeds in capturing who he was, which ultimately was he had a rough childhood, he had an abusive father, he was considered like a failed prodigy, and yet he was obviously immensely talented. He just kept running into troubles. He had a very difficult time kind of taking care of himself and maintaining his relationships. He frequently would get into arguments with people and feel bad about it and try to make it up to them. And he just had a very tumultuous life. And the loves of his life were, it was also very tumultuous, lots of heartbreak, and yet through all of it, he went through periods of depression, of anger, and being unproductive, having trouble taking care of himself, and yet he would still keep breaking through to write some of the greatest music of all time. In fact, I would say there is no composer, at least in my mind, in my heart, who achieved what he achieved. There may be some that were more technically talented, even though he was for sure that. Others who were more experimental or whatever, appealed more to the heart of the mind, because other romantic composers would try to emulate him and not quite get there. But to kind of use music as a conduit for emotion in a way that was tempered, and he was coming off the Enlightenment. He believed in Enlightenment ideals, but he also believed in kind of being in touch with your emotions and expressing them. Anyway, I'm scratching the surface really, but as far as the movie goes, Oldman's performance as Beethoven I thought was spot on. I still see it as one of his greatest performances for a very great actor. And there are certain scenes in this film that just really, I think, touch on who Beethoven was, and ultimately the greatness of music and what it can do for our common humanity. He was a very angsty loner kind of a guy, and yet he would tap into these universal feelings and expressions, and anyway, and that's what it's about. I feel like this film somehow manages to capture that, along with the different eras of the late 18th century, early 19th century, and what was going on in the world with Napoleon and Metternich, and it was just kind of a very fascinating period in the arts and in philosophy. And then there was this this composer. The table might be shaking because my cat's giving herself a scratch, but yeah. So the film, especially Beethoven as a man, it's hard for me to really put into words. But the most I can say is that it really does transcend its medium. It's a film about music, and it captures it and expresses it, and I just love revisiting it every time. So, and I will also add here that when I've taken the one overseas trip I've made in my life to Europe, I flew through Milan and then immediately got on a plane to Vienna. And the next day, the very first thing I did on my trip, which lasted a few weeks, was visit Beethoven's grave and the Zinschelfriedhof, however it's pronounced. My pronunciation, I think we all know. If you follow my channel, my pronunciation is not great, but it's just south of Vienna, and that was where my kind of it was a moment for me. So those are my top 3 films, and they're not as well known as others, and I could talk about why I love them. Again, to emphasize on Immortal Beloved, it's got, it's not a historical, like there are documentaries if you want to just get the straight dope, so to speak, but the fact that it captures, that it touches kind of what the music meant is just profound. It's, yeah, can't say enough. And it's beautiful to watch. And the music is fantastic, including that one particular scene with the Kreutzer Sonata. Yeah. So let me know what you think. Hopefully there are other people out there that love these movies, or talk about if you have favorite movies that are not quite as well known or as popular as others. All right. Take care.